our Summer at SoCo 2021 video podcast series. My name is Ryan Blue, and here with me today is Jared Carter. Jared, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no problem.
We are going to today dive into John chapter 2, the story of Jesus turning water into wine, which he spoke on yesterday. And if you did not see that, if you're not at SoCo, go online, watch it. It was really, really great. And so we're going to kind of jump into the story a little bit more. Now, at the end, I want to come back and kind of hit your interactions, your takeaways, and your action points. And so let's just jump right into it. So John chapter 2, Jesus turning water into wine. Let's kind of break this down a little bit. Verse 1, on the third day, a wedding took place in Cana at Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had been invited. So if we just stop there and kind of break that down, we're talking about the third day, which would be the third day after the events of chapter 1. A wedding took place in Cana. So from geography and history, we can kind of piece together and make some inferences here. One is that Cana and Nazareth were pretty close together, and Nazareth was where?
It's where Jesus grew up.
Okay. And so in a wedding, the whole town would have been invited, right?
Yeah.
The towns were very, very small. Everybody knew everybody.
You probably didn't travel to great distances back then. You probably stuck around your hometown.
Yes, absolutely. And so a wedding in the Jewish culture would have been a ceremony followed by a feast that lasted for about 7 days. And so as Jesus is an invite to the wedding, he probably knew these people, knew their families, might have even grown up with them, and might have known them for years. So he's invited and he shows up, and at some point, verse 3, during these 7 days, they run out of wine.
Right.
Now, this could have been an embarrassment to them, right? You're having a reception and you run out, and years later, it's like, hey, remember that wedding we went to and they ran out of wine? So, interestingly, Jesus' mother comes to him and says they have no more wine. And I've always kind of wondered why she did that, why she came and talked to him. You know, why didn't she go to the master of the banquet?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and maybe we can infer some things. I don't know, maybe we can guess on some things, but I think from the very beginning, Mary knows that Jesus is the Messiah, right? I mean, she's been prophesied that too. She's been, an angel has appeared to her, so she probably knows what Jesus might be capable of. Mm-hmm. Yeah, to some degree.
Could be. Or it could just be, hey, have you heard, that they're about to they ran out of wine? But Jesus, interestingly, says back to her, woman, why do you involve me, right? So, first of all, woman in English, that might come across a little derogatory.
Yeah, it comes across harsh, doesn't it?
Yeah. But in that culture, it really would not have.
Right.
It was a very polite, kind term. In fact, when he's being crucified, he says, woman, behold your son, which was not derogatory in that context at all. But he says, why do you involve me? And from Jesus' standpoint, I mean, great question, right? Why are you getting me involved in this? In fact, because he says, my hour has not yet come, meaning he's probably not yet ready to launch his public ministry because he hasn't really done that yet. He's called some of his disciples, but he hasn't performed any miracles yet.
Right, and I think this, to your point about the context with Pastor Brad of John writing this book so people might believe in him, and at the end of the story, the disciples believe in him and follow him, and once you make public miracles, I mean, people are going to start taking notice, they're going to start following you. To your point, maybe he just wasn't ready for that.
Yeah, maybe he wasn't, and so, but yet he has his friends who are in a predicament, and so he says, I can go ahead and help them.
Right.
But that's kind of speed up my timeline of what I had planned for my ministry. So it's interesting that Jesus maybe altered his timeline so he could help them out.
Right.
So it shows you how much he truly cared about them. So nearby stood 6 stone water jars that they used for ceremonial washing, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. So if my math is correct, we're talking 150 to 180 gallons here. And these jars for ceremonial washing, they were set aside specifically for that purpose, to wash your hands before and after the meals. These would have not have been jars that they would have drunk out of.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you brought up the point of how big the jars were, because I think I've always just assumed, they just grabbed something and filled it with water, but in order for the miracle to take place, I mean, these were massive jars. Like, manpower had to go into it, the servants had to do this, And I can think what they were thinking in their head. All right, why am I carrying this stuff? Why am I constantly filling this with water? They didn't know what was going to happen.
Probably took several people to carry them.
Yeah.
They probably had to go find a well, get the water out, bring it back. So it might have taken a while.
Yeah, could have.
For this to happen. So Jesus said to them, go fill these jars with water, and they filled them all the way to the top. And he says, now take them to the master of the banquet, who would have been the person kind of in charge of the feast. And when they did so, he tasted the water that had been turned into wine and realized where it did not know where it had come from, but they did, the servants did.
Right.
So I kind of always imagine how their reaction would have been, right? They just went all this time to fill up all these jars with water, and then as it's being poured out, all of a sudden it's wine. Like, we'd love to have seen their reaction to that.
Yeah, I love how the servants were probably amazed that Jesus turned water into wine, but the master of the ceremony, who didn't really know, he was just amazed that the best wine was coming out right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The best wine, and then 180 gallons of it. We don't know how much wine they had before.
Probably not 180 gallons. Maybe. That's a lot of wine.
So Jesus just gave them really good wine to drink and a whole lot of it.
Yeah.
So it just kind of goes to your point, he wants to bless us with the best. We'll talk about it in a minute. He kind of went overboard
Yeah,
here.
he did.
So again, the master of the banquet says, you bring out the best at the end. And he was very, very impressed by that. So by doing this miracle, Jesus kind of saved the bride and the groom and their family from embarrassment, saved the master of the banquet from embarrassment, he failing his job. But then all of the guests, they were kind of blessed because
Right.
the party got to keep on going.
Yeah.
So let's go back and hit your 3 takeaways that you talked about yesterday, or Sunday. God's desire to bless us. Number 2, God is working even when we're not aware. And number 3, God blesses us with the best. So you've used the word bless there. In this context, it was making more wine to keep the party going.
Yeah.
What would that look like today for us? When we say God blesses us and blesses us with the best, what does that look like?
Yeah, and I think from this story, the big takeaway that I was trying to portray yesterday was this idea of God judging us versus God blessing us. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that God blesses us. I didn't really focus on what the blessing was, but that his character is good and he wants to bless us. And I made this analogy to the verse in Matthew chapter 7, if we know how to give good gifts to our children, how much more will he give to those who ask him? But I think blessing scripturally can come in different ways. Maybe God blesses us sometimes in how we want to be blessed, but a lot of times the Bible is so counterintuitive in the way that we think that the Bible talks about how we rejoice in tribulation. Mm-hmm. So maybe blessing sometimes comes in some valley times and some low times. And we get to the other side and realize how God did bless us. It makes me think of the question in Bruce Almighty, if you ask for patience, does God just give you patience, or does he give you the opportunity to become patient? Right. And also sometimes we think of the blessing, it has to be the big things in life, right? Getting the next job or a great family or healing from a disease. But for them, it was just keeping the party going. Yeah, and I think that's something that we hit on yesterday. Interesting that his first miracle wasn't raising somebody from the dead. It was already something that was being celebrated, and to your point, he just blessed them and just made it better. Mm-hmm.
So, Jared, your 3 actions in your Sunday was, number 1, believe that God is good and be obedient to his word. Number 2, keep going. Keep swimming. I remember. Yeah. God is working when I don't see it. And number 3, make room for God-sized blessings in your life. So that can kind of live itself out in an individual level, but yet also in community as well. So give me, from your takeaways, what does that look like individually, and then what does that look like in community?
Yeah, I think the biggest one that I would focus on, because I think we're going to end with talking about believing in God. Yeah. But I think the biggest one for me is making room for God-sized blessings, because he, like you said, it was 180 gallons. It was the best wine, and I think sometimes God doesn't work on our timeline. Sometimes we want the instant gratification. So instead of waiting on the blessings of God, we kind of fill our lives with fake things or replicated things, whether it's social media, whether it's things we watch, things we listen to, and just kind of pushing things out and making room. And what happens when we make room, and I think this goes into the community aspect, it does away with our excuses. I can't fulfill the call of God because I'm too busy. I can't join a community group. I can't get involved because of this. I can't pray. I can't do these things. And it kind of gets rid of those excuses to where we fulfill our lives with things that God can bless us with.
I have one more question for you, and then we'll go to the last verse that you mentioned earlier about believing in him. If I'm going to lead a community group this week,
right,
or if I'm in my community group, what's one question that we could pose to the group for discussion this week?
Yeah, I think, the verse comes to mind, rejoice with those that rejoice, weep with those that weep. So I think one question that I would ask to community group leaders and that you ask in your community groups is, how is God blessing you in your life right now? And like we said, a lot of times that comes in different ways. So maybe it's something that you're walking through that, like, I know God's got a plan for me and I'm going to see it on the other side. But looking around in your community group and thinking, because a lot of times God does bless us relationally. So even if we're walking through the valley, God has blessed us with people that we can lean on. So right now, how is God blessing you in your life? And I think you had a question for the community groups as well.
Sure. On the flip side of that, if you're not experiencing the blessing, then why not?
Yeah.
I mean, are you being, like you said, obedient to his word in your first point? Are you following him and believing in him? So let me just go ahead and jump to that last verse. When Jesus did this miracle in Cana and he revealed his glory, it says, and his disciples believed in him. And that was the Greek word pisteuo that Brad and I talked about, this active belief. Now remember, the disciples had already left their homes and were traveling around with him. But it wasn't until he performed this miracle that they actually believed in him, this actual active belief. And so, again, as we mentioned in the last podcast, that's kind of our goal, is that when you see these interactions with Jesus that we're talking about over the next several weeks, that you come to have this active belief that you put forth in your everyday life. So thanks for joining us for week 2 of our video podcast series. And the next one, we'll be talking about the woman at the well from John chapter 4. So remember, throughout this series, we want you to be there on Sundays or watch online if you can't. Get in a community group, watch the video podcast each week, and read through the book of John. So you've got time to get through the first couple of chapters and get on to chapter 4 for our next time. Thanks for joining us.